You're listening to the Fort Erie Podcast, your local source for upcoming events, hot new listings, and bite-sized interviews with business and community leaders. Here's your host, Brent Jones.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 10 of the Fort Erie Podcast. It is Tuesday, April 28, 2020, and I'm your host, Brent Jones. And this is, believe it or not, the second to last episode of the season. So let's not waste any time. I'm going to have two guests for you today. My first guest will be Antonietta Culic, Marketing and Media Relations Manager with the Fort Erie Race Track. But first, let's dive into some local news headlines. Check this out. A new initiative is putting Fort Erie businesses on the map. The town has created an interactive online tool that allows for local businesses to update their hours and status during the COVID-19 crisis. This was an initiative, I believe, put together by the Economic Development Office, and it can be found at businessmap.forterie.ca. Local businesses can claim their profile and alert residents as to whether they're open for business as usual, open with restrictions, or temporarily closed. And now the Waverly Beach Condo Showdown, if we can call it that, meaning the legal showdown, is set for next month, the month of May. After 3 years of debate, the local planning appeal tribunal for the controversial Waverly Woods housing development is less than a month away, where a judge will decide if the developer can move forward with plans to build a 10-story condo, 66 houses, and 61 townhomes in that space. There are, of course, environmentalists and others who oppose this development. As always, you can find links to these stories below this episode, but my second guest today, joining me later, will be James Culic from Niagara this week to share his thoughts on the Waverly Woods development. All right, let's see what's on your mind, Fort Erie. Checking in with the Fort Erie Questions and Answers Facebook group. Here are some questions posed by local residents this week. Clipper asks, can anyone recommend a good deck builder around Fort Erie? And there were several recommendations in the comments, but the two most common were Marshall's on Grandview Road, as well as R2G Construction, and you can look them up online. Brando asks, are there any mobile automotive locksmiths in Fort Erie? The short answer is yes, and the most common recommendation that I saw in the comments was for Keybro Security Solutions on Garrison Road. And what the heck, we got time. Let's look at a third question here. Les asks, are there any local businesses who sell drumsticks? And the most common response was Nomad, the music store in Stevensville, right on Stevensville Road. Okay, now it's time for my interview with Antonietta, and this is an interview really done in two parts. So the first part of this interview was done with Antonietta back when we, sat down a couple of months ago, and she, of course, was very optimistic about this racing season at the Fort Erie Race Track. We talked about some of its history and highlights from past years and some of its economic impact. You'll hear that part of the interview first, and you'll be able to tell it's that part because there's kind of a noisy fan in the office where we were sitting. You'll hear a bit of a hum in the background. Then you'll hear a short transition, and we'll begin with part two of the interview. Antonietta was kind enough to join me by phone over this past weekend to kind of update us on how COVID-19 has impacted the racetrack and the racing schedule for 2020. So without further ado, here we go. And we're back. I am joined by Antonietta Culic, Marketing Manager of Fort Erie Race Track. Welcome to the show, Antonietta.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for spending some time with me. I appreciate that. Let me start first by asking you, what makes Fort Erie such an awesome place to live and work?
I love the small sense of community that Fort Erie has. There's a lot to offer here. It's a small, quiet town, but we still have enough big things to keep us going, and we're close to bigger cities like Niagara Falls and Buffalo. So if you need more, there's there. But it's also a small, close-knit tight community, and that's really important to me.
Absolutely, yeah. And how long have you been associated with the racetrack, and what do you do?
So we're coming up on my fourth season here at Fort Erie Race Track. I'm the Manager of Marketing and Media Relations. So basically my job is to try and bring people here.
I gotcha, okay. And have you always lived in Fort Erie? Like, were you familiar with the racetrack kind of growing up? And
Yeah, born and raised in Fort Erie, so it's a town that's close to my heart. But I moved away for university, and I lived in Hamilton for a year working at McMaster. But moved back to town, and it's been great to live in town and work in town. And Fort Erie Race Track, it's a fun place.
Well, I gotta be honest, like my wife and I moved to Fort Erie 5 years ago, and we always knew the racetrack was here, but it wasn't really until this past summer that I actually started coming out for some of the races. And I didn't actually realize how big of an event it is, like, and the kind of crowd it brings out.
If you've never been to the racetrack, I encourage you to come out and see what it is. You know, you don't have to be intimidated by betting or wagering. You know, just come and enjoy the day. It's a great venue.
We'll talk more about racing, certainly, but if it's all right with you, I'd like to jump into kind of the rapid fire question round, so I can listeners can get to know a little bit more about you, kind of fun little trivia questions about yourself. I'll rattle off a whole bunch of questions and you just blurt out the first thing that comes to mind. Sound good?
Sounds good.
You ready? Okay. First question, would you rather cuddle with a baby panda or a baby penguin?
Oh, baby panda.
Name any one of the 7 dwarfs.
Sleepy.
Would you want to live forever if you could?
No. No, I feel like there's like an expiration date. Like, I feel like eventually it would get depressing.
Okay, that's fair enough. What's for dinner tonight?
Oh, I haven't thought that far ahead.
All right. How many pull-ups could you do in a row?
Pull-ups?
Yeah.
Not many.
Not many, okay. Do you have a favorite type of tea?
Yes, all I drink is tea. I'm not a coffee drinker. I love the smell of coffee, but I don't drink it. So I love my traditional Earl Grey, but I'm also a peppermint, lemon ginger, chamomile type of drinker too.
It's funny, I'm the opposite. I actually drink exclusively coffee, but I love the smell of tea. There we go. What's the fastest speed you've ever driven a car?
Oh, I can't say.
Okay, that's an honest answer, I think.
Maybe like 120.
120? 125? Oh my goodness. Cake or pie?
Both.
And lastly, is it wrong for a vegetarian to eat animal crackers? No. All right, you passed. That was the rapid fire question round.
You
did well.
Than it sounds, Have you ever done this rapid fire question thing?
No, but no, I haven't actually.
Okay, then I'm going to come up with a list of questions and I'm going to ask you.
The next episode is going to be you interviewing me, I guess, with the rapid fire questions. So, all right, no, I'm good with that. Well, let's get back to talking about racing, because maybe it was just me living under a rock who'd never been out to a race night before, never been out to one of the Tuesday nights at the track. But when you think of like the big crowd that comes out, and I don't know if you have stats on this, is it mostly local people, or is there a breakdown, or do a lot of people come from out of town, and if so, from where?
So it's kind of hard for us to say because we don't charge admission. There's a lot of data that we don't can't collect just because it's difficult to, but there are some things that I've done in the past to try and get some of that information. So I know about 20% of our visitors are from the US.
Really?
They come over and attend the races here. Probably about 35% of them are, Fort Erie, Ridgeway sort of residents. The rest of that, I think about 5 to 10% is kind of outside of Niagara. So, Hamilton, Toronto, that sort of stuff. The remainder are, Niagara residents. So we get a lot of support from the community, but at the same time, there's a lot of people who come out from within Niagara to come to the races.
Well, of course, I'm going to put links to the racetrack and everything going on at the racetrack in the show notes below the episode. But just kind of before we wrap up, I don't know if this question is too hard, but could you pick out a couple of favorite highlights or memories from this past racing season in 2019? Like, what were some of the best moments?
I would say people absolutely love the Wiener Dog and the Basset Hound races. As funny as it is, they're silly, they're cute, they bring out a lot of people, so people love those events. Of course, traditional events like the Prince of Wales Stakes, the second jewel in the Canadian Triple Crown, that is our signature event, our big day. It's been around for a long time.
How long has the Fort Erie Race Track been in existence?
This is our 123rd racing season.
Wow, that's crazy.
We've been here for a long time.
Very, very cool. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so COVID-19 is definitely changing how we operate at the racetrack. So for this year, we've put a lot of new rules in place in our backstretch. So we have, it's common for thoroughbred horses to stable at a racetrack, and that's true in Fort Erie as well. So we have a lot of horses that are now back in Niagara, or, coming back to our backstretch, who need a safe place where they can go to exercise, because that's an essential part of care for horses, is that they need to be able to exercise and stretch their legs. And our facility is designed for them to be able to do that. So at this point, obviously, there's so many cancellations that are happening everywhere. We don't think that we're going to be racing on time for our opening day, which is originally scheduled for May 26th. It's likely going to be postponed, and then when we are back up and running, we're looking at probably not racing to fans. So we would just be televised in on the simulcast market, and people can bet through devices like HPI Bet in order to, see the races and put their wagers in. So everything right now is still largely unknown. Horses need a certain amount of time to train to prepare for a race, so we have to give them, a month or so much notice in order to start, training for racing. Right now, they're largely just exercising. They're not, really getting race ready. So they do need a certain amount of prep time. And until we kind of know when we're going to be able to open, we'll probably have to, push it a couple weeks after that.
And we're back. Folks, before I get to my second guest today, it's time for the final real estate tip segment of Season 2. Joining me to talk about how to prep your home to sell is Ray Rosatani with RE/MAX Niagara Realty.
So what would be the 1 to 2 things I would recommend a homeowner do to prepare their home for listing and putting it on the market? Number 1 would be to declutter. If you have a lot of personal items laying around, that might be big and bulky, that could perhaps make a room appear a lot smaller than it actually is. You want to give the potential purchasers the feel of space. And if there's a lot of stuff they have to walk through or walk around in going through a property, it just kind of sets the tone without actually setting the tone. And the one thing too, I always say to homeowners is if you're planning on moving, why not pack up all the stuff that you're not using on a day-to-day basis just to make it appear to be much larger.
Now, to conclude today's episode is James Culic, as promised. And yes, if you didn't figure it out, this episode is sort of a double Culic feature with both husband and wife joining me today. James, of course, doesn't work for the racetrack like his wife does. You probably best know him for his sometimes polarizing opinion pieces in Niagara this week. He'll conclude today's episode sharing his thoughts on the Waverly Woods development. Joining me next week for the season finale of the Fort Erie podcast will be my guest, Dino Kentros, owner of the Barrel Italian restaurant on Garrison Road. So long, everybody. Stay safe and stay healthy out there.
We finally had some nice weather this weekend, so I decided to go for a bike ride along the waterfront trail, which of course eventually led me to the infamous Waverly Woods. And yes, I know, technically I wasn't supposed to be in there. It's private property. I was trespassing, whatever. So we're like 100 other people. Okay, everyone goes through Waverly Woods. The real issue here is the impending LPAT trial. It's next month. A judge is going to decide whether or not the developer can remake that space into a residential area. 10-story condo tower, 60-some-odd townhomes, another 60-some-odd single detached dwellings. Some people think it's a good idea. Some people don't. The people who don't have organized into a group. They're called Voices of Fort Erie. They've got little buttons that say Save Waverly Woods. For the most part, they're good people, but here's why I think their efforts are misguided. Because Waverly Woods is kind of junky. And I know that's blasphemous to some people, that they think that's hallowed ground, that blah, 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 it's sacred space. But there's graffiti and garbage all over the place. There's big, sharp concrete blocks left over from the amusement park with rusted bolts sticking out of them. It's not a nice area. It's not a well-maintained area. So if we really want to claim that it's such a beautiful, sacred space, I would be more inclined to believe that if people weren't also letting their dogs poop all over the place and throwing their garbage directly into those woods. So I think the best thing for Waverly Woods is to let this developer do what he plans to do there. If we really want to save Waverly Woods, we should let this developer destroy it first, and then have him put it back together into something better, something safer, something cleaner than my cat's litter box.
You've been listening to the Fort Erie Podcast with your host, Brent Jones, a sales representative with RE/MAX Niagara Realty Limited Brokerage. Follow @BuyWithBrent on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for updates. Subscribe to the Fort Erie Podcast on popular platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and catch a new bite-sized episode every week. Until next time.